I'm told by David, I believe, that since I have such a soft voice, that they were going to have to work with the mics. And so, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Good morning. I certainly do appreciate the opportunity to be able to come before you this morning to share some thoughts. And boy, do we need some thoughts right now. True? All we have to do is just pay attention to the conversations around us. Whether it's the conversations that we hear as a result of newscasts, whether it's in our groups, our friend groups, the people around us, our workers, our colleagues, our family, there's lots of conversation going on right now. And unfortunately, some of the conversations is hard to make sense of. Do you understand what I'm saying? Some of it's hard to make sense of because it's all over the place. And it's full of rhetoric. So I have to confess that as I began thinking about this after Slade had asked if I would consider this opportunity, I had the thought that, and really had been thinking, separate from all of the political stuff that's going on, I have this thought of how many churches there are across our country. And so have been sort of paying a lot of attention to that. Now, I'm not a preacher. If you're visiting this morning, I'm an educator. And so the best thing you can hope for is that I will teach a lesson this morning as an educator. But I do love my work as an educator because I have an opportunity to influence the people that are associated with the system that I work with, the school system. And as a Christian, that's an important thing. So let me go back to the thought that was really motivating me over the past few weeks. And that was, again, observing all of these churches and thinking, my goodness, with so many churches, you would think that the world would be in better shape than it's in. Now, wouldn't you? And so then I started doing some research on that to say, if there are so many churches, so many people that are influenced by churches, what does it really look like in terms of involvement? And this is what I discovered. What I discovered was that while there are lots and lots and lots of churches, church attendance is questionable at best. There was a report that suggests that there's like an 80% attendance in churches. And we know that's not true. Right? Well, let me say it this way. Even if we were just talking about the members of this congregation, we would say that's not true. True? True, that's not true. Right. But then there was another study that provided some more realistic information. And that other study suggests that church attendance is at best about 40%. But within a few short years, it might be as low as 20%. So it's not hard to understand why the world is in the shape that it's in right now. But one other thought that I want to share with you before we move on. If you somehow believe, and I don't care what your politics is, that your politics is going to change this world, I'm going to say you might want to reconsider your thoughts, because I don't think so. And in fact, that's going to be the real focus of my conversation with you this morning. And so I want to begin by looking at the passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. that's in front of you there, where it says, "For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live shall no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised." So what I want to talk about over the next few minutes is God's compelling love. And what does that mean to us as Christians? Now, while I do have a lot of slides, I only have about 20 minutes. And so I've deemed that perhaps if I could, and I have 4 points basically, so if I give myself just a few minutes for each point, then we'll be done, and you won't look at me funny at the conclusion of this lesson. So, let's talk about this. God's compelling love and what that really means to us. Let's see. Not what I want to see. You can take me to the second one and I'll be happy. There we go. So, think about the condition that I was talking about of this world, but also think I'm not going to talk with you about politics, because I don't believe that it's going to be through politics that this world is going to change. So this is my first point. God's love should compel us to live for him. And that seemed fairly simple enough. That's a simple point. God's love should compel us to live for him. But I promise you, it's not that simple. I promise you it's not that simple. In the book of Galatians, chapter 2, beginning in verse 20, as you see, it says, "I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ live in me. The life I now live, I live in the body. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself to me." So I want us to think about a time in your life when you felt compelled to do or to say something profound. A time in your life when there was something that you needed to say or do. And how did you respond or deal with that? What did it look like? And how did it make you feel? I'm going to share with you an incident actually that happened just a few days ago. A few days ago, I purchased a car for my daughter, and it was from a private owner, and the car came with only one set of keys. And so it's one of those key sets that has a chip inside of it, so you can't just go to any locksmith to have a second key made. So you got to go to some special locksmith to have it done. So I went online and started looking for a locksmith that handles such. And so I found one in Tampa, one in Orlando, one in Tallahassee. I was actually planning to travel to Tallahassee to take the car, so I thought, well, I'll check with the Tallahassee one. I'd already checked with the Orlando one and knew that I could purchase the key for about $60. I checked with the local dealership and I could purchase it for about $175. So you know what I was thinking at that point. There was no question about where I was going to get that key from, Orlando or somewhere else other than the dealership. So anyway, but I called ahead to Tallahassee just to check. So I talked with, when I called this locksmith, the guy referred me, he took my name and my number and he said, John Doe is going to give you a call in just a few minutes. Okay, John Doe called me up in just a few moments. And so then I said, I'm headed to Tallahassee. I just bought a car. It only has one key and I want to have another one made. It has a chip in it. Okay. And so I said, well, I have to have the car with me in order to have the key made. He said, well, yeah, you'll have to have the card. I said, well, okay, tell me, what's your charge for that? And he said, well, it'll be $89. And it almost sounded like he was just making up a number in his head, but maybe not, maybe not. So anyway, he says $89. And I said, well, actually, I've talked with someone in this area where I'm living right now, in the Orlando area, and I said that I can get one for less than that. And so I hung up. After we both hung up there. Well, I didn't just hang up on him, but we ended our conversation. So within a moment, I received a phone call. And I looked, and it was the number of the first person that I had called that referred me to this second person. And so when I answered the phone, the guy says, do you always lie to men? And I said, what? He said, well, do you always lie to men? And I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, I'm just asking, do you always lie to men? I said, well, sir, I don't know who you are, but I'm not sure what you're talking about. He said, well, just answer the question. Do you always lie to men? I said, well, no, I don't always lie to men. He said, well, that's your second lie. Okay. All right. Well, this is interesting. And so then we talked for a little while. And then I said, I'm not sure who you are, what really your point is. But I said, but it sounds like you're a religious person. And so he started saying some religious kinds of things. And I said, I think I'm right, that I think you're a believer. I said, but I'm not quite sure where you're going with this conversation. I said, but if you're trying to reach out to me as a believer, you're going about it the wrong way. I said, because the only thing I'm hearing you say is I'm condemned because of some lies or something. And he said, do you always lie to men? You know, kept going back to that. And so I said, well, I'm not quite sure. I said, but if I were you, I would think about if I'm trying to present something to someone in order to convince them in the glory of God, this is not the way you're going to do that. And so we eventually ended our conversation. I did get my key in Orlando. It was $65 instead of $60. Not quite sure exactly where that young man was coming from that I talked with, the do you always lie to men conversation. But I promise you, that person is probably a believer. And that person probably thought that he was going to challenge me. Again, I'm not sure what the lie supposedly was. I don't really know where that was coming from. But I just sensed, even as I shared with him, that he was a person who believed. And he was going to straighten me out, I guess, on being a liar about what, I'm not sure. Anyway, what I'm talking about now is that compelling love and nature of God. It's not as simple as it sometimes seems. And so that guy was compelled to share a message with me. But as a recipient of that message, if I was an unbeliever, would I be drawn closer to God through his conversation with me? That's all I'm saying. Would I be drawn closer to him as a result of him? He said simply, when I answered the phone, do you always lie to men? And I tried to put that in perspective. And I'm thinking Jesus with the woman at the well. Or I'm trying to think about situations that I know scripturally of how maybe Jesus would have confronted somebody or just how it would have been very different. But I just couldn't feel God's love coming from that person, even if his intentions were right. And again, I don't know what his intentions were. I didn't buy the key from him. I know that. Not any question about that. So I want to take you to a point. And if I could get the next slide. One more. Okay, thank you. So what you have there is a situation in Moses' life. And I want you to think about this now. So Moses, he's out doing his work, tending the flock. Comes to a point and he notices something happening there. A burning bush. But the strangest thing about this was that although the bush was on fire, it was not really burning up. And so his own curiosity compelled him to want to go and to check it out, to see what it was all about. And so as he approached that burning bush, God spoke to him. God spoke to him. And I'll read it. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of the Midians. And he led the flock far outside of the wilderness and came to Horeb in the mountains of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared with him in flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire. It did not burn. So Moses thought, I will go over and see the strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And so he approached the bush. And says, when the Lord saw Moses had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush. And he said, Moses, Moses. And he replied, here I am. He says, don't come any closer. Don't come any closer. And so then God, he understood something a little bit different at that point. Moses understood something a little bit different. Then he says, I'm the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, Moses fell on his face because he was afraid to look at God. So at that point, what happened was Moses realized what he was really dealing with. And what he was really dealing with was the nature of God and God's nature, God himself in the bush. And it caused him to do what? He reacted, he responded. And that was to put his head down because he realized he was in the presence of God. So let me talk with you now. I'm going to hopefully make a little transition here. So I was talking about the compelling nature of God and how God expects certain things of us and how we're to live up to those. And yet, how life is not that simple. But I think this is really important. And if you go to the next slide. So, the two observations, Moses was clearly compelled, and his compulsion led him, his curiosity, his interest led him to approaching the bush. But then this is what's really important in this conversation now. The most important thing that we learned from Moses' experience with the burning bush was about the absolute holiness of God and his nature. Now that really is important as we continue on in my conversation with you. The man that I talked with on the phone believed that he was doing what's right in his challenge to me. But he's no different than us. Quite often in our lives, as Christians, we believe that we're doing what's right in whatever we're doing, especially if we're, quote, taking a stand for God. But this is my big point at this juncture in my lesson. We often don't really understand God and his nature. And that really is important for us to understand. Because sometimes we go in a direction that we shouldn't go, like Moses was about to. He didn't understand what he was really dealing with there. And God had to stop him. So this is what I'm saying to us as Christians. Sometimes we need to be stopped. And to adjust ourselves, to reacquaint ourselves with God and his nature. Because if we don't, we're going to make a mistake. I believe that guy was sincere on the phone, but he was making a terrible mistake. If nothing else, the insult back to me as a potential customer. But more importantly, if I'm standing up for Christ, then wouldn't I go in the direction that Christ wants me to go instead of the direction that I think I should be going? And I think all too often that's the challenge for us as Christians. And I'll show you that eventually. Next slide. So, our nature as Christians often conflicts with God's nature. Next slide. This is why I believe such. In 2 Corinthians 4, it says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." Now, I hope that we will begin to understand where I'm coming from. So, it says we have this treasure in jars of clay. If you go to the next slide, the passage goes from 7 to 11. And if I was breaking that passage down, I would say, okay, we have the treasure and we have the jars of clay. And who do you think we are? The treasure or the jar of clay? And I mean, we know. We are the jars of clay. Now, I want us to think about that. We're the jars of clay, and we have this treasure that's within us. Let's think about that jar of clay. Let's think about that jar of clay. That jar of clay is fragile. True? Oh, it's fragile. We might not believe that. But let us be faced with a circumstance in life that we're not ready for. Guess what happens to us? We crumble sometimes. We fall apart. It's vulnerable, even gullible at times. It's steeped in human nature. And it's often a work of a master. A work of a master. If you've ever worked with clay, clay is a lump until someone begins to mold and to work with it. And then it becomes something. It could be a jar, a vase, it could be a work of art. But it's influenced by someone or something, right? You remember, we are supposed to be that workman. We are supposed to be that workman of God. We're supposed to be that vessel, that thing that he has worked into shape to have a noble purpose. But guess what happens in this life? It happens. Life happens. Circumstances, situations, attitudes, feelings, dispositions happen. And guess what those things do to us? Believe it or not, sometimes those things influence us to go in a different direction than what God would have us to go into. I'm just saying. And so we're sometimes fragile. If we were thinking about God or that treasure that's mentioned also in that same passage, we're thinking about knowledge, commitment, power, faith, love, Christ Jesus. So we have the treasure and we have the pot or the pottery or the jar. And it says that in God's reasoning, he decided that that treasure would be embedded in that pot. And I promise you, all we could say to that is, thank you, Lord. You understand what I'm saying? All we could say to it is, thank you, Lord, that he would deem us worthy, not because of us, that that treasure would be allowed in us. And so he has. But I want us to still think about the characteristics of that pot. Because if we're going to be compelled to do what God has asked us to do, there's got to be some metamorphosis of that pot. There's got to be some firing of that pot. If you work with clay, you know that you work with it in its rough state, but then at some point it has to be fired in order for it to be refined enough to do its work. And if it's not fired, guess what? It's even more fragile. And so there's a firing that must take place in our lives. But much of that has to do with God disciplining us and working with us, refining us, helping us to realize the dream that he has for us. And boy, that's tough at times. I promise you that's tough. Because it goes against our very nature. See, our nature is not to be refined like that. Not to be in pursuit of perfection. Our nature is to be something other than that. And yet God is trying to refine us and to make us into that. I'll help you put it in perspective. I want us to if you flip over a couple of slides there. Another. One more. And I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about. You see this picture, and this picture is a picture of Peter with the Lord. And this is just really to make a simple point. Peter with the Lord. And you see Peter reaching for something, right? What is he reaching for? He's reaching for a sword. And what does Peter plan to do with that sword? He's going to defend the Lord. He's going to take care of whoever he felt like was insulting or going against his Lord. And so Peter goes for his sword to pull that thing. And not only goes for it, but what does he do? He chops off a man's ear. I want you to think about our nature. How we're so quick to defend the Lord, but sometimes in all the wrong ways. We really are trying to stand up. The guy who was insulting me was trying to stand up for what he thought was right. His statement was, "Do you always lie to men?" Peter pulls a sword. He's defending the Lord the wrong way. I'm saying we're that vulnerable, that gullible at times. We will do things in our effort to stand up for the Lord. It's the wrong thing at that time. That's all I'm saying. Move another slide. Give it one more example, and we'll be closing this out in just a moment. In the book of Jonah, chapter 3, it says, "Then the words of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." Jonah obeyed the words of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And this is what happened. The next verse says, then the Ninevites believed. They believed. They responded to the message. Now, what we will learn is that perhaps wasn't really Jonah's desire to see them respond that way. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction that he had threatened. But to Jonah, I'm now in chapter 4, it says, but to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That this is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. If you go to the next slide, that's Jonah, at least a portrayal of Jonah. And he's sitting under this little shelter. And if you've read the book of Jonah, you know the story. And this is the story. He's there lamenting, sulking. But God teaches him a lesson even in that. So God provides the shelter for him. The next day, it sort of burns up or withers. Jonah's distraught. What's going on here? So God questions him. You didn't put it together. Why are you concerned about it? You didn't create that. Why are you concerned about that? God is making this point. I created the people of this world. It is for me to save them if I want to save them. It's not your business, Jonah. You remember what I said? Sometimes our mindset, our attitude interferes with what God intends and what he desires. Even when we're trying to do what's right. What I'm telling us, me included, there are times when we have to get out of the way and let God be God and do his work. That's what I'm saying. The last slide. Well, we go back one, and I'll read this one passage, and then we'll go to the last slide. And this is in 2 Corinthians 4. It says, therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ is Lord, and ourselves as your servant for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. And go to the last slide. And so my final point is this. We have to trust God and believe that God, regardless of the circumstances that we see in this world, God is in control. God is in control. As much as we might find it hard to believe, God is in control. Despite our perceptions of the world around us, and despite our personal feelings of justice or injustice, like Jonah, we must go out into this world and simply obey. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servant for Jesus' sake. And I'm telling you, folks, that's a hard thing to do, because it goes against our very fabric, our nature as human beings. We always want to reason something. We always want to counter it with, but, or we always have an alternative. God is God. He made us. He knows us. And we must let God be God. And again, you look out into this world and you think, my God, what in the world is going on? God is in control. If we don't trust that, we might as well pack it up and move on. True. Only because things do happen. But God prevails. And we must allow him to prevail in our own lives and allow him to shape or reshape or to make us to be more able to handle the stuff that we have to put up with at times. We have to be able to endure the stuff that we have to put up with at times. But unless God is a liar, he will prevail even in what we think might be the worst of circumstances. But we have to trust him. So the challenge for all of us is this. We must be compelled by God's love to do God's work. But we must do it on his terms and not our own terms. With his direction and not our own direction. Remember the sword. We must do it on his terms. Now, I'm not a preacher, but I do know this. When we hear things that challenge our assumptions, our belief, our faith, or our own actions, there are times when we should be compelled to respond. And at this time, Wayne is going to come forward and lead us in a song. And if you feel so compelled to respond, then I invite you to do so this morning. Thank you.